Does he have any knives? Any knives?
No.
Guns?
They have guns.
The suspect is armed.
Hey, we're gonna block the main entrance right here.
My neighbors threatened me, threatened to kill me, threatened to kill police. I have it on video.
We have deployed a SWAT team en route to...
Step out slow!
Shot out.
Move!
Before anyone could react, he said one thing that changed everything. "I'm not coming out. This ends today." Seconds later, police realized this wasn't just a disturbance call. It was the beginning of a 30-hour armed standoff, with a man who believed he was no longer human. Before we get into this case, subscribe if you want more real, carefully researched true crime stories like this. Let's start. The call that changed everything. It started like any other routine dispatch. Another early morning disturbance call in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The kind of call officers respond to almost on autopilot. No urgency. No expectation of violence. Just a complaint between neighbors that would likely be resolved with a warning and a report. But within minutes, everything changed. At exactly 6:45 a.m., the calm of Steel Creek, Charlotte was shattered. Residents on Greer Fork Drive began dialing 911 in a panic. Their voices trembled, overlapping, each call more urgent than the last. A man had stepped outside his home, megaphone in hand, shouting threats loud enough to echo through the entire street. He wasn't just arguing. He wasn't just angry. He was promising violence. "My neighbor is threatening me. He said he's going to kill me," one caller reported, fear unmistakable in her voice. Another caller confirmed it. Then another. Within moments, dispatch realized this wasn't an isolated complaint. It was a rapidly escalating situation involving multiple witnesses, all describing the same man, the same threats, and the same growing sense of danger. The suspect stood in his front yard, broadcasting his rage through a megaphone, making sure every neighbor heard him. There was no attempt to hide. No hesitation. Just raw, unfiltered hostility directed at anyone within earshot. And then came the detail that changed the entire response. He might be armed. As officers were dispatched to the scene, the tone shifted immediately. What began as a routine disturbance was now being treated as a potentially dangerous encounter. The responding officers, still en route, began asking the questions that would determine how they approached the situation. Does he have any weapons? Any knives? Any guns? The answers weren't clear at first. Panic rarely delivers perfect information. But as more calls came in, a pattern began to form. There were mentions of a firearm. A revolver. Possibly loaded. Now the stakes were different. When the first officers arrived, they didn't rush in. They slowed, observed, positioned themselves carefully. The house sat quietly from the outside, but the tension in the air was undeniable. Neighbors were watching from behind curtains, peeking through blinds, hoping this would end quickly, but fearing it wouldn't. The suspect was still inside. And somewhere in that house, there was a gun. Officers quickly made the decision to keep their distance. There would be no reckless approach, no unnecessary risks. They needed information, clear, reliable information, and they needed it fast. That's when they encountered the language barrier. The suspect's mother had been one of the callers, but communication was difficult. Misunderstandings in a situation like this could be deadly. So officers reached out to someone who could help, her daughter. Over the phone, the tension carried through every word as officers worked to confirm what they were dealing with. "Can you ask her if he has a gun?" Pause. Then the answer came back. "Yes, he has a revolver." The officer didn't hesitate. He pressed further. "Is it loaded?" Another pause. "Yes, it's loaded." In that moment, the situation escalated again. Now it wasn't just a man making threats. It was a man making threats, with a loaded firearm inside the house. The officers adjusted immediately. Positions tightened. Lines of sight were reconsidered. Every movement became deliberate, calculated. They knew one wrong step could trigger something irreversible. But there was more. The daughter continued translating, struggling at times to fully explain what her mother was saying. There were mentions of other items, possibly weapons, but nothing confirmed. What they did learn, however, added another unpredictable element to the situation. There were dogs inside the house. 2 of them. One medium-sized. One small. It might seem insignificant, but in a high-risk scenario, even a dog can change everything. It could alert the suspect, create chaos, or even attack officers during an entry. Every variable mattered. By now, a clearer picture was forming. The suspect, identified as Ty, was no stranger to law enforcement. In fact, this wasn't even close to his first interaction with police. Records showed that officers had been called to deal with him dozens of times before. Threats, disturbances, erratic behavior, it was a pattern that had been building over time. But this was different. This was bigger. Because this time, Ty wasn't just unstable. He was armed. He was making direct threats. And he had already crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. There was also something else working against him. A warrant. Ty already had an active warrant for his arrest related to previous threats. That changed everything about how officers were required to respond. This was no longer just about calming a situation. It was about taking him into custody. And that distinction mattered. Because in law enforcement, there's a critical difference between someone who is simply in crisis and someone who is both in crisis and wanted for a crime. This was now classified as a criminal barricade, which meant one thing. This situation had just entered a completely different level of danger. Officers on scene knew they were no longer equipped to handle this alone. The presence of a firearm, the suspect's history, the active warrant, it all pointed to one conclusion. They needed backup. Not just more officers. They needed SWAT. But SWAT wasn't there yet. And until they arrived, it was up to the initial officers to hold the line. They began calling out to Ty from a safe distance, their voices controlled, steady, attempting to establish communication without provoking him. "Mr. Ty, this is the police. We need you to come outside." Silence. Then movement. A voice from inside. Unpredictable. Defensive. Suspicious. "Are you going to kill me?" That question alone told officers everything they needed to know about his state of mind. This wasn't just defiance. This was fear, paranoia, possibly something deeper. "No," the officer responded calmly. "We're not here to hurt you. But trust is fragile in moments like this. And you're going to put me in handcuffs?" Ty asked. The officer didn't lie. "Yes, we have to. Honesty can build trust, but it can also push someone further away. And in this case, it did." The conversation began to loop. Questions repeated. Answers rejected. Every attempt to reason with him seemed to circle back to the same place. Fear. Defiance. And one growing certainty from Ty himself. He wasn't coming out. As minutes turned into hours, it became clear that this situation wasn't going to resolve quickly. The calm suburban street was now the center of a developing crisis. Officers maintained their positions, waiting, watching, hoping for a breakthrough. But deep down they knew. This was only the beginning. What started as a simple disturbance call had now evolved into something far more dangerous. A standoff. And soon, it would become something even bigger. When backup becomes war, by the time the initial officers realized what they were dealing with, the situation had already crossed a line that couldn't be walked back. This was no longer a neighborhood dispute. This was no longer a routine call. This was now a full-scale armed barricade situation, and every second that passed without control increased the risk of it turning deadly. The officers on scene had done everything by the book so far. They created distance. They gathered intelligence. They attempted communication. But one thing had become painfully clear. Ty wasn't thinking rationally. Every response from inside the house came layered with paranoia, confusion, and unpredictability. One moment he sounded fearful. The next, aggressive. One moment he asked questions. The next he rejected every answer. And in situations like this, unpredictability is the most dangerous variable of all. Because you can't negotiate with something you can't anticipate. As more units arrived on scene, the street transformed. What was once a quiet residential block was now locked down. Patrol cars lined the road. Officers took positions behind cover. The perimeter expanded outward, creating distance not just for safety, but for control. Neighbors were quietly evacuated where possible. Others were instructed to stay inside, away from windows. The message was clear without being spoken. Stay out of sight. Stay alive. Inside the command structure forming outside, a decision had already been made. SWAT was on the way. But until they arrived, the responsibility remained with the officers already there. And that meant one thing. Keep him talking. A trained negotiator stepped in, taking over communication. His voice was calm, measured, controlled. Every word carefully chosen. Every sentence designed to de-escalate, not provoke. "Mr. Ty, I want to understand what's going on. Talk to me." There was a pause. Then Ty responded, but not with clarity. His thoughts jumped. His tone shifted. His words didn't always connect. It was like trying to piece together a puzzle where the pieces didn't belong to the same picture. "Are you going to kill me?" Again that same question. The negotiator didn't hesitate. "No. Nobody here wants to hurt you." That answer mattered. Because in Ty's mind, this wasn't an arrest. This was a threat to his life. "And you're going to take me away, somewhere far?" There it was again, fear mixed with suspicion. The negotiator leaned into honesty. "You do have a warrant. We do have to take you in. But listen to me, this is not a big deal. We just need you to come outside safely." That line, "This is not a big deal," was intentional. Because in crisis negotiation, perception is everything. If Ty believed his situation was hopeless, he might act like it was. But if he believed there was a way out, he might take it. For a moment, it almost seemed like it was working. The tone softened. The tension eased slightly. There was a brief window where Ty sounded less aggressive, more uncertain. But then, everything snapped back. This is war. Just 3 words. But they changed everything. Because now in his mind this wasn't a conversation anymore. It was a battle. The negotiator immediately tried to pull it back. This is not war. Nobody here is against you. But Ty wasn't listening anymore. The conversation began looping again, back to fear, back to defiance, back to the same conclusion. I'm not coming out. Over and over again. At this point the officers knew something critical. Negotiation alone might not be enough. Time was now their greatest ally. Because the longer they could keep him contained, the more options they would have once SWAT arrived. But time also works both ways. Because the longer this dragged on, the more unstable Ty could become. Inside the house he was isolated, armed, and spiraling deeper into whatever mental state had taken hold of him. And outside, officers had to prepare for the possibility that this could turn violent without warning. That's when the updates started coming in. Additional background on Ty. His history with police. His previous incidents. His behavioral patterns. This wasn't new. Ty had been on law enforcement's radar for a long time. Multiple prior calls. Repeated disturbances. Escalating behavior over time. And now, it had reached a breaking point. This would be their 47th interaction with him. 47. That number alone told a story. A story of missed intervention, repeated warnings, and a situation that had slowly built to this exact moment. And now, all of it was converging into a single high-risk standoff. Back at the scene, officers adjusted their positioning again. Vehicles were used as cover. Angles were calculated. Lines of sight were carefully maintained toward the house. Because at any moment, that front door could open. And if it did, they needed to be ready. Then came another development. Ty mentioned something that raised even more concern. Voices. Not people. Voices in his head. They're controlling me. I can't control it. That statement changed everything about how officers interpreted the situation. This wasn't just defiance anymore. This was a possible mental health crisis at its peak. And that made the situation even more unpredictable. Because now it wasn't just Ty making decisions. It was whatever he believed was controlling him. The negotiator immediately shifted approach. You're stronger than that. You can control it. We can help you. This wasn't about logic anymore. It was about grounding him, stabilizing him, giving him something to hold on to mentally. But Ty pushed back. I'm going to die today. Those words hung in the air. Because statements like that are never taken lightly. They signal something dangerous, something final. And when a suspect starts talking like that, the risk level increases dramatically. At this point, command made another critical decision. They weren't going to rush this. No forced entry. No aggressive escalation. Not yet. Because despite everything, there was still a chance this could end peacefully. But that window was closing. And everyone on scene knew it. Minutes stretched into hours. The sun climbed higher. The neighborhood remained frozen in tension. Officers rotated positions, maintaining focus, staying alert. And then, finally, the sound they had been waiting for. Heavy vehicles. Specialized units. SWAT had arrived. The shift was immediate. This was no longer a patrol response. This was now a tactical operation. Armored vehicles rolled into position. Officers in full tactical gear began coordinating with command. Equipment was unloaded. Roles were assigned. Snipers began identifying vantage points. Less lethal options were prepared. Drones. Robots. Breaching tools. Everything was now on the table. Because SWAT doesn't arrive to observe. They arrive to end it. But even with all that firepower, the objective remained the same. Resolve it without loss of life. The negotiator made one more attempt. Mr. Ty, SWAT is here now. But listen to me, we don't want to use any of that. We want you to come out safely. Silence. The movement inside. Unclear. Unpredictable. Every officer locked in. Watching. Waiting. Because now, there was no going back. Inside the breaking point with SWAT now fully deployed, the entire tone of the situation shifted from containment to controlled pressure. Up until this moment, everything had been about distance, patience, and communication. But now, with a heavily armed suspect barricaded inside, refusing to surrender and showing clear signs of psychological instability, SWAT had to begin actively shaping the environment. Because when negotiation stalls, pressure becomes the tool. The command post was established just outside the immediate perimeter. From there, every movement, every decision, every contingency was being mapped out in real time. This wasn't just about getting Ty out of the house anymore, it was about doing it in a way that minimized risk to everyone involved, including him. But the problem was simple. They still couldn't see him. And that made everything more dangerous. Inside that house, Ty had complete control of the environment. He knew the layout. He knew the blind spots. He knew exactly where he could hide, and where officers couldn't see him. That kind of advantage can turn even a small house into a battlefield. So SWAT turned to something designed to take that advantage away. Technology. The first step was deploying a ground robot. Small, durable, built to navigate tight spaces. Its job was simple: enter the house, move through the lower level, and transmit real-time visuals back to the command team. But nothing about this environment was simple. As the robot approached the entry point, operators immediately noticed something unusual. The house was cluttered. Not just messy, obstructed. Furniture, objects, debris, placed in ways that made movement difficult. Whether intentional or not, it created a maze of obstacles that slowed the robot's progress and limited its visibility. Still, they pushed forward. Carefully. Methodically. Every inch gained inside that house meant more information. And in situations like this, information is survival. The robot moved into the living room. Cameras scanned left. Right. Nothing. No clear visual on Ty. Just silence and tension. Then came the next challenge. Stairs. The robot couldn't climb them effectively. Not in that condition, not with the clutter, not without risking losing control or damaging the unit. And that's when SWAT made the next call. If they couldn't go up from the ground, they would go above. A drone was brought in. Lightweight. Fast. Equipped with a live camera feed. Unlike the robot, the drone wasn't limited by obstacles on the floor. It could move freely, navigate tight angles, and most importantly, reach the second level. The operator launched it. The quiet hum of the drone cut through the tension as it lifted into position and moved toward the house. Carefully, it entered. Inside, the visuals were chaotic. Dim lighting. Tight spaces. Objects scattered throughout the rooms. The drone maneuvered slowly, adjusting to the environment, feeding back every frame to the team outside. And then, movement. A figure. For the first time, SWAT had eyes on Ty. But the moment didn't last. Before they could fully assess the situation, the feed cut. The drone dropped. Destroyed. Ty had taken it out. Just like that. The message was clear. He wasn't just hiding. He was actively resisting. A second drone was deployed. Faster this time. More cautious. Adjusting its flight path based on what they had just learned. It made it further. Captured more angles. Confirmed more details. But once again, it didn't last. The second drone was also destroyed. Now SWAT knew two critical things. 1. Ty was armed and willing to use force against anything entering his space. And 2. They had just identified his location. Upstairs. That alone shifted the tactical approach. But before they could act on it, something unexpected happened. The front door moved. Slowly. Then, he appeared. Ty stepped into view. For the first time during the entire standoff, he was visible from the outside. And in his hand, a handgun. Every officer on scene locked in instantly. This was the moment they had been preparing for. Snipers already positioned across multiple vantage points adjusted their aim. Every angle covered. Every movement tracked. Because now, the threat was no longer theoretical. It was visible. Real. Immediate. Ty stood in the doorway, partially exposed, holding the weapon. From the outside, it was impossible to fully predict his next move. Would he raise it? Would he fire? Would he retreat? In that moment, every second stretched. Every decision mattered. Then, a shot rang out. Sure. Controlled. A warning shot. Fired by one of the sharpshooters who believed Ty's movement posed a credible threat. It wasn't meant to hit him. It was meant to stop him. And it worked. Ty froze. Then immediately retreated back inside. Door closing. Line of sight gone. Just like that, the moment passed. But the tension didn't. Because now, it had escalated again. A firearm had been introduced into the open. A shot had been fired. And everyone knew. Next time, it might not be a warning. Inside the house, something shifted. Minutes later, Ty made a call to 911. But what he said changed everything. He claimed he had been shot. He hadn't. But that wasn't the most alarming part. His voice, his identity, his words, they were different. My name is Lucifer. That statement echoed through the command post. Not because of what it meant literally, but because of what it revealed mentally. This wasn't just instability anymore. This was a complete psychological break. And it didn't stop there. Over the course of the next exchanges, Ty shifted between multiple identities, each one more detached from reality than the last. 4 distinct personalities, each with its own tone, its own belief system, its own perception of what was happening. And for negotiators, that created a new kind of challenge. Because now they weren't just talking to one person. They were talking to whoever showed up in that moment. So they adapted. If he said he was Lucifer, they spoke to Lucifer. Not to validate the delusion, but to maintain communication. Because communication meant control. And control meant time. Lucifer, we're here to help you. That line wasn't accidental. It was strategic. Because breaking that connection, even for a moment, could push him further into isolation, and closer to something irreversible. Hours continued to pass. The daylight began to fade. And with it, Any hope of a quick resolution. Inside the house, Ty remained hidden, armed, and unpredictable. Outside, SWAT continued to tighten control. But everyone knew. This situation had reached a critical point. Because now, it wasn't just about getting him out. It was about preventing what could happen if he didn't. And the longer this continued, the more dangerous that possibility became. Breaking the house, breaking the mind. By the time darkness began to creep over the neighborhood, the situation had already stretched far beyond what anyone expected. Hours had passed. Communication had stalled. And despite every attempt to resolve things peacefully, Ty was still inside. Still armed. Still unstable. Still refusing to come out. At this stage, SWAT faced a difficult reality. Negotiation alone wasn't working. And when communication fails, strategy shifts. Because in a standoff like this, the objective is not just to wait, it's to apply controlled pressure. Not reckless force. Not aggression. But calculated actions designed to slowly strip away a suspect's sense of control. Inside that house, Ty still believed he had control. He had the walls. He had the cover. He had the ability to hide. So SWAT made a decision. They were going to take that away from him, piece by piece. The first move was subtle, but significant. They approached the front of the house again. Not to rush in. Not to force a confrontation. But to send a message. The negotiator continued speaking calmly, maintaining that fragile line of communication. Mr. Ty, we're still here. Nobody wants to hurt you. We just need you to come outside. But inside, Ty's responses were becoming more erratic. More emotional. More disconnected from reality. He wasn't just resisting anymore. He was unraveling. So SWAT initiated the next phase. Tactical breaching. To an outsider, it might look like simple destruction. Breaking windows, forcing doors. But in reality, it's a highly controlled tactic designed to achieve multiple objectives at once. Visibility. Psychological pressure. The first breach targeted the front door. A loud, forceful impact shattered the stillness of the night. The door gave way. Not fully, but enough to open the house visually to the outside. For the first time, Ty's barrier between himself and law enforcement had been physically compromised. And his reaction was immediate. Anger. Frustration. You broke my door. His voice echoed from inside, louder now, sharper. Because that door wasn't just wood and hinges. It was control. And SWAT had just taken a piece of it. The negotiator tried to stabilize the moment. We can fix the door. We'll take care of it. Just come outside safely. That reassurance wasn't random, it was deliberate. Because when you remove something from a suspect, you have to offer something back. Balance the pressure. But Ty wasn't accepting it. I told you not to do that. The frustration in his voice was building, feeding into the instability that had already taken hold. And SWAT knew. This was a risk. Because every action they took could push him closer to surrender. Or closer to violence. But doing nothing wasn't an option either. So they escalated, carefully. The second breach was more aggressive. This time they didn't just weaken the door. They removed it. Completely. Ripping it off its hinges and exposing the entryway fully. Now the house was no longer sealed. There was no clear separation between inside and outside. Just an open threshold. And that changed the dynamic completely. From inside, Ty could now see more of them. And from outside, they could see more of him. But visibility comes with risk. Because it also increases the chances of confrontation. Inside, Ty's mental state continued to deteriorate. His words became more frantic. More disjointed. I can't control it, the voice is controlling me. That statement hit differently now. Because it wasn't just a claim. It was a window into what he was experiencing. Whatever was happening inside his mind, it was getting worse. The negotiator leaned in again. You're stronger than that. You can control it. Don't let that voice win. This wasn't about logic anymore. It was about anchoring him, giving him something to fight against internally. But Ty pushed back harder than before. I have no control. I'm under mind control. The intensity of his voice made it clear. He believed it. Completely. And belief like that can be dangerous. Because if someone feels like they've lost control, they might stop trying to hold on to it. Outside, SWAT adjusted again. They weren't rushing in. Not yet. Because despite everything, they still didn't have full visibility of where he was positioned inside. And walking into that blind would be a mistake. So instead, they kept applying pressure. Windows were breached next. One by one. Glass shattered across the structure, opening new lines of sight into the house. Each break served a purpose. More visibility. More exposure. Less control for Ty. But with every impact, his agitation grew. You're trying to ruin my house. That anger wasn't just about property. It was about losing control of his environment. And that was exactly what SWAT intended. Because the less comfortable he felt inside, the more likely he would come out. Still, they balanced it carefully. Too much pressure too fast could push him over the edge. So between each action, the negotiator returned. Calm voice. Steady tone. Rebuilding that fragile connection. We don't want to hurt you. We're trying to help you. But the words were losing their impact. Because inside Ty's mind, this wasn't help. This was an attack. And the more the house changed around him, the more that belief hardened. Hours passed. The house was no longer intact. Doors gone. Windows shattered. Interior exposed in fragments. What was once a place of control had become something else entirely. Unstable. Uncomfortable. Unpredictable. Just like Ty himself. And yet, he still didn't come out. That's what made this moment so critical. Because by now, SWAT had applied significant pressure, without achieving the one outcome they needed. Surrender. Which meant only one thing. The next phase would have to go further. Because this wasn't ending tonight. And everyone on scene knew it. As the operation pushed deeper into the night, lights illuminated the broken structure, casting long shadows across the street. Officers rotated positions, staying alert, watching for any movement. Inside, Ty remained hidden. But not silent. His voice continued to echo out, shifting between anger, fear, confusion, and something else entirely. Something harder to define. And with every passing hour, the line between control and chaos grew thinner. Because now, it wasn't just about breaking the house. It was about breaking through whatever was happening inside his mind. And that would take more than force. The warrant that changed everything by now, the standoff had stretched deep into the night, and what started as a disturbance call had fully transformed into a prolonged, high-risk tactical operation. The house was no longer intact. The front door was gone. Windows had been shattered. The perimeter was locked down. And still, Ty refused to come out. Despite hours of negotiation, pressure, and strategic breaching, nothing had broken through. Not his resistance. Not his mindset. Not the barrier, psychological or physical, that kept him inside. And that's when command faced a critical limitation. Up to this point, every action taken by law enforcement had been carefully calculated, but still restricted. There were legal boundaries that could not be crossed without proper authorization. Because no matter how dangerous the situation becomes, entry into a private residence still requires justification. Even now. Even here. And that meant one thing. They needed a search warrant. But before that could happen, another process had already been set into motion behind the scenes. An involuntary commitment order. This wasn't the first time Ty had been considered for one. In fact, it would be the third. Officers and crisis teams had encountered him before, had seen the signs, had attempted intervention. But this time, it was undeniable. Ty was not in control of his mental state. His words, his actions, his behavior, it all pointed toward someone experiencing a severe psychological episode. The mention of voices, the shifting identities, the paranoia, and now the refusal to surrender despite overwhelming presence. This was no longer just about law enforcement. This was about mental health. But even with that understanding, the danger hadn't changed. He was still armed, still inside, still unpredictable. So while one team worked to secure the involuntary commitment order, another moved quickly to obtain the warrant that would allow SWAT to take the next step. Time mattered here. Because every hour that passed increased the risk of escalation. Inside the command center, officers coordinated with legal channels, presenting the facts. Armed suspect. Active threats. History of instability. Failure to comply. Public safety at risk. It didn't take long. Within a few hours, the warrant was approved. And just like that, everything changed. Because now, SWAT had full legal authority to enter the house. Not just breach. Not just observe. But go in. This marked a turning point in the operation. Up until now, they had been working from the outside, probing, pressuring, negotiating. Now, they could take control of the inside. But that didn't mean rushing in blindly. If anything, it meant the opposite. Because entering a structure with an armed, unstable suspect is one of the most dangerous scenarios in law enforcement. Every doorway could be a threat. Every corner a blind spot. Every second a potential trigger. So instead of immediate entry, they prepared. The next phase began with something known as tactical clearing through controlled access. More breaching. More visibility. More control. Without exposing officers unnecessarily. SWAT teams repositioned again. Equipment was adjusted. Roles reassigned. Every member knew exactly what they were responsible for. Because once movement began, there would be no room for hesitation. The breaching continued, but now it was more precise. More strategic. Windows were cleared not just for visibility, but for potential entry points. Barriers were removed to create multiple access routes. This wasn't random destruction anymore. This was structured control of the environment. Inside, Ty reacted the only way he knew how. With anger. With confusion. With resistance. You have no right. This is my house. His voice echoed through the broken structure, filled with frustration. But legally, that had changed. They did have the right now. And that shift in authority was critical. because it meant SWAT no longer had to wait for permission to act. They could dictate the pace. Still, the negotiator stayed engaged, because even with full authority, the goal remained the same. Get him out safely. We have a warrant, Ty. We can come in. But we don't want to. We want you to come out on your own. That line was important, because it gave him a choice. And in situations like this, giving a suspect a sense of choice can sometimes be the difference between surrender and escalation. But Ty wasn't ready to give that up. I'm not leaving. His voice cut through the night again. Defiant. Final. At least, for now. Outside, SWAT continued preparing for possible entry. Officers moved with precision, checking angles, confirming positions, ensuring every potential threat was accounted for. Because once they stepped inside, everything would change. But before that happened, they made one more move. Technology. Again. The robot was sent back in, this time with a clearer objective. Map the interior more effectively. Identify obstacles. Confirm pathways. And most importantly, reduce uncertainty. The robot pushed forward through debris, navigating the damage caused by earlier breaching efforts. Slowly. Deliberately. Camera scanning. Every detail mattered now. Furniture placement. Doorways. Stair access. Potential hiding spots. Because in a structure like this, knowledge is survival. At the same time, drone deployment was reassessed. The earlier attempts had been destroyed, but they had provided something valuable. Confirmation. They knew where Ty was operating from. Upstairs. And that changed how they approached the structure entirely. Instead of focusing solely on entry, they began thinking vertically. Containment from above. Control from below. Pressure from all sides. This was no longer just a standoff. This was a coordinated tactical operation with multiple layers. And Ty was at the center of it. Inside, his behavior continued to spiral. The voices, the identities, the anger, all still there. But now, something else had been added. Fatigue. Because even the most intense situations take a toll. And after hours of isolation, stress, and constant pressure, cracks begin to form. SWAT knew that. They were counting on it. Because fatigue can lower resistance. It can weaken resolve. It can create openings where none existed before. But it can also make someone more unpredictable. More desperate. And that's what made this moment so dangerous. Because now, they were entering a phase where anything could happen. The house was no longer a safe space. It was compromised. Exposed. Controlled from the outside. And slowly, that pressure was building inward. Ty could feel it. He just wasn't ready to act on it. Yet. Total surveillance, total pressure as the operation moved into its second day, the entire atmosphere shifted again. What had once been a tense but controlled standoff was now evolving into something far more complex. Something slower, heavier, and far more dangerous. Because at this stage, it wasn't about quick resolution anymore. It was about control over time, space, and psychology. Ty was still inside. Still armed. Still unstable. Still refusing to surrender. But something had changed. He was no longer in control of his environment. SWAT had taken that. Piece by piece. Angle by angle. And now they were about to take something even more critical. Awareness. Up until now, Ty had been reacting to what he could see and hear. The voices outside. The breaches. The movement. The noise. But SWAT's next move was designed to shift that balance entirely. They were going to see everything. Without being seen. Surveillance dominance. The robot remained inside, acting as a low-level scout, feeding visuals from the lower floor. Every movement it captured was analyzed in real time. Patterns. Sounds. Shadows. Anything that could indicate Ty's position or movement. But the real advantage came from above. The drone program, despite earlier losses, had provided something invaluable. Knowledge of the structure and Ty's likely location. So instead of rushing another drone blindly, they adjusted. This time it wasn't just about flying in. It was about controlling the airspace around the house. External aerial observation. Thermal scanning. Angle tracking from outside windows and openings created during earlier breaching. Every possible visual gap was now being used. From outside, officers began to piece together a more complete picture of the interior. Movement patterns upstairs. Moments of stillness. Shifts in position. Ty was still active, but slower now. More erratic. Less predictable. Fatigue was setting in. And SWAT knew exactly how to use that. Because exhaustion can do what force cannot. It breaks resistance. But it also creates risk. Because a tired suspect is a volatile suspect. More likely to panic. More likely to miscalculate. More likely to act without thinking. So every move from this point forward had to be precise. Measured. Controlled. Inside, Ty's voice still echoed at times. Fragmented, inconsistent, drifting between identities and emotions. At one moment he sounded angry. The next, confused. Then, fearful. Then something else entirely. Detached. I'm an angel. I don't need anything. Statements like that made it clear. He was no longer grounded in reality. And that meant logic alone wouldn't reach him. Outside, SWAT continued tightening the perimeter, not physically but psychologically. Every light, every sound, every presence, it all added pressure. Because even when nothing was happening, everything was happening. Silence can be just as powerful as action. And in those quiet moments, Ty was left alone with his thoughts. With the voices, with the uncertainty. That isolation was intentional. Because when a suspect feels cut off from everything, they start looking for an exit. Even if they don't realize it. The negotiator remained active, checking in at intervals. Never pushing too hard. Never disappearing completely. Maintaining that thin thread of communication. Ty, we're still here. You're not alone. We can help you. That line mattered more now than ever. Because despite everything, they needed him to believe there was still a way out. But time was still passing. And with every hour, the pressure increased. Then came the next escalation. Vehicles in the driveway. 2 of them. Until now they had remained untouched. Possible tools for escape, cover, or even barricade reinforcement. SWAT couldn't leave that variable in play. So they removed them. Carefully. Deliberately. Under full tactical coverage. Engines off. Neutral. Rolled away from the structure. Might seem small. But removing those vehicles did 2 things. First, it eliminated any chance of a sudden breakout attempt. Second, it sent a message. You are contained. Completely. Inside, Ty would have heard it. Felt it. Another piece of his environment, gone. Another layer of control, stripped away. By now the house itself had transformed. What was once a home was now something else entirely. A controlled zone. An exposed structure. A place where every movement was being watched, analyzed, anticipated. And yet, he still didn't come out. That was the most critical part. Because at this level of pressure, most standoffs begin to resolve. Fatigue, isolation, exposure, it usually leads to surrender. But not this time. Which meant one thing. They needed to escalate again. But carefully. Because pushing too far, too fast, could trigger the very outcome they were trying to avoid. So SWAT began preparing the next phase. Less lethal tactics. Tools designed not to harm, but to overwhelm the senses. Because if they couldn't reach him mentally, they would reach him physically. Through environment. Through discomfort. Through controlled disruption. The plan was forming. And everyone on scene knew. This next step would likely decide how this ends. Inside, Ty's movements had slowed even more. Periods of silence grew longer. Moments of stillness more frequent. But that didn't mean safety. It meant unpredictability. Because when someone reaches that level of exhaustion, they either break, or they snap. And no one on scene knew which one this would be. The sun had risen again. A full cycle had passed. Nearly a full day of containment, negotiation, pressure, and control. And still, no resolution. But that was about to change. Because SWAT had reached the point where waiting alone was no longer enough. They had shaped the environment. They had controlled the space. They had applied psychological pressure. Now, they were ready to apply something more direct. Something that would force a decision. One way, or another. Breaking the environment. By the time the operation crossed deeper into the second day, the strategy had shifted completely. This was no longer about waiting. No longer about hoping time alone would wear him down. Because Ty had already proven something critical. He wasn't going to surrender just because the pressure was building. He was enduring it, absorbing it, surviving inside it. And that meant one thing for SWAT. If they wanted this to end, they had to change the environment itself. Everything up to this point had been controlled, calculated, and deliberate. The perimeter was locked. The structure had been partially opened. Surveillance was established. Communication was ongoing. But now they were moving into a different phase. A phase designed not just to contain, but to disrupt. Inside the command structure, the decision was made. Less lethal tools would be deployed. Not to harm. Not to injure. But to overwhelm. To force movement. To break stagnation. Because stagnation in a standoff like this is dangerous. It gives the suspect time to stabilize mentally, or spiral deeper. And in Ty's case, it was clearly the latter. His earlier statements still echoed in the minds of officers. I'm an angel. I don't need anything. Fragments of a reality that didn't exist. And that meant negotiation alone was no longer enough. They needed something that would force a response. So the plan was set. The first move, cut the power. The house, already damaged and exposed, would now be plunged into darkness. No lights. No comfort. No sense of normalcy. Because light gives control. And removing it takes that control away. When the power was cut, the shift was immediate. Inside, Ty reacted. His voice rang out again, louder this time. What did you do? There was panic now. Not just anger. Not just defiance. But confusion. Because another layer of his environment had just been taken from him. And that's exactly what SWAT wanted. Each step wasn't random. It was progressive. Strategic. Layered pressure designed to guide him toward one outcome, exit. But he still didn't move. So the next step followed. Smoke. Deployed carefully. Controlled. Measured. Not enough to suffocate, but enough to disrupt. Enough to make staying inside uncomfortable. Unstable. Unpredictable. The first canister was introduced through an opening created earlier during breaching. A hiss. Then expansion. Smoke began to spread slowly through the interior, creeping along floors, rising into rooms, filling the space Ty had been hiding in for hours. Outside, every officer watched closely, because this was a critical moment. Smoke changes everything. It affects visibility, breathing, movement. It forces decisions. Inside, Ty's reaction was immediate. Coughing, shouting, movement. For the first time in hours, there was clear, undeniable activity. Not just pacing, not just talking, but reacting. You're trying to kill me? His voice cracked through the structure. But the truth was, they were trying to save him. Even if it didn't feel that way. The negotiator stepped in again, voice steady, controlled. Ty, listen to me. We're not trying to hurt you. Come outside. This can end right now. That line was timed perfectly. Because in moments of discomfort, people look for relief. And SWAT was offering it. Right there. Just outside. But stepping outside meant surrender. And Ty was still holding on to something. Fear. Control. Or maybe just confusion. Inside, the smoke thickened in certain areas, forcing him to move again. From one room to another. From one position to another. And every movement was being tracked, watched, analyzed. Because now, SWAT had something they didn't have before. Predictability through pressure. When someone is forced to move, patterns begin to form. Escape routes get tested. Safe spots get revealed. And weaknesses become visible. The robot feed confirmed movement upstairs again. But slower now. More erratic. Ty wasn't just resisting anymore. He was struggling. Physically, mentally, emotionally. The pressure was working. But it was also escalating the risk. Because at any moment, that pressure could turn into panic. And panic in a situation like this can be deadly. So SWAT maintained balance. More smoke but controlled. More pressure but measured. No sudden overwhelming force. Just enough to keep pushing him forward. Outside, the scene was almost surreal. Daylight fully illuminated the neighborhood, yet everything remained frozen in tension. Neighbors watching from a distance. Officers locked in position. Every eye focused on one structure. One person. One outcome. Inside, Ty's voice had changed again. Less shouting. More confusion. Fragments of speech. Moments of silence. Then sudden bursts of panic. He was breaking. Not completely. Not yet. But the cracks were widening. And SWAT knew. This was the moment where everything mattered most. Push too hard. And he might react unpredictably. Not enough. And the standoff continues. So they held the line. Maintained the pressure. And waited. Because now, for the first time since this began, Ty was no longer just holding out. He was being forced to make a decision. Stay. Or come out. And with every second that passed, that decision became harder to avoid. The breaking point by now, the standoff had reached a critical stage. Ty had been inside his home for more than 20 hours, barricaded, armed, and increasingly unstable. Every tactic deployed up to this point, the perimeter containment, tactical breaching, robot surveillance, drones, power cut, and smoke deployment, had begun to push him toward the edge. This was the moment SWAT had been preparing for. The breaking point where calculated pressure would finally force action. The atmosphere outside the house was tense beyond measure. The officers knew that every sound, every movement, every shout could trigger a violent reaction. One misstep and a bullet could be fired. But patience was key. Patience and precision had already proven themselves in countless standoffs. Inside, Ty's mind was unraveling. Multiple personalities had emerged over the course of the standoff, each one a fragment of the chaos consuming him. At one point he spoke as Lucifer, claiming to be someone beyond himself, beyond human reasoning. He screamed, shouted, and cursed. He paced through the smoke-filled, darkened rooms. Every step revealed the precariousness of his mental state. The officers understood that this was more than just defiance. It was a severe psychological crisis. The negotiator maintained contact as SWAT continued to manipulate the environment. Every measure was designed to induce compliance without escalating violence. More smoke was deployed. Tactical lights flashed intermittently. Even the presence of officers behind riot shields was deliberately visible yet non-threatening, a constant reminder of control without direct confrontation. From the command center, the operation was meticulously monitored. Drones provided real-time footage of Ty moving through the interior, revealing which rooms he occupied, where he might hide, and the locations of his firearms and other hazards. Robots moved strategically, creating minimal disturbance while assessing the situation. Each deployment was a calculated move to further isolate him psychologically while keeping officers and neighbors safe. As hours passed, Ty's reactions intensified. He attempted to barricade himself further, pushing furniture against doors and windows. He shouted at the officers outside, insisting that they could not force him. Yet, the combination of darkness, smoke and isolation had begun to take its toll. Movement became sluggish. Voice cracks became frequent. Moments of silence revealed hesitation, uncertainty, and fatigue. The negotiator seized these moments, carefully crafting communication that acknowledged Ty's fear while offering him a way out. "Ty, you don't have to stay here. You can come out safely. No one is going to hurt you." These words were repeated over and over, synchronized with every environmental disruption, every smoke release, every drone scan. It was a delicate dance, too much pressure and he might lash out, too little and the standoff could drag on indefinitely. Finally, as the night deepened and the smoke thickened, Ty made a crucial move. He began descending the stairs toward the front door. It was the first time in hours that he had shown intent to leave his stronghold voluntarily. SWAT officers adjusted positions, less lethal tools at the ready, eyes trained, hands steady. The negotiator continued to coax him, guiding him toward a peaceful surrender. It was a tense, slow-motion moment. Ty emerged from the shadows, every step measured, every gesture observed. Officers signaled him calmly but firmly. A canine companion was seen following closely behind, still under control. Ty's handgun, which had posed a lethal threat for over 30 hours, was concealed, but officers were ready for any sudden movement. The team moved precisely as trained. The OC powder, already deployed, created enough psychological and sensory pressure to convince Ty that continuing resistance was futile. The combination of isolation, smoke, darkness, and negotiation had achieved its purpose. He was tired, confused, and finally receptive to surrender. In a carefully orchestrated final move, Ty reached the front yard. Officers guided him to a secure position, keeping his hands visible, ensuring the dog remained calm, and maintaining a buffer between him and the tactical team. One officer calmly retrieved the concealed handgun, removing the last element of immediate danger. At that moment, the standoff that had begun over a simple neighborhood dispute had ended. 30 hours of high-stakes negotiation, precise tactical operations, and psychological strategy had culminated in a peaceful resolution. Not a single officer or neighbor was harmed. Ty was taken into custody, alive, and the neighborhood was safe once again. This chapter highlights the delicate balance between pressure and patience, between force and negotiation, and the extraordinary coordination required to resolve a criminal barricade without tragedy. After the silence when Ty finally stepped out of that house, everything changed. Not just for the officers who had spent over 30 hours locked into one of the most intense standoffs of their careers, but for everyone watching. Because moments earlier this could have ended very differently. One wrong move, one miscalculation, 1 second of panic, and the outcome wouldn't be a peaceful surrender. It would have been a tragedy. But instead, there was silence. A rare kind of silence. The kind that only comes after chaos has completely drained itself out. The flashing lights were still there. The armored vehicles hadn't moved. Officers still held their positions. But the tension? Gone. Replaced with something else. Relief. Controlled. Professional. But undeniable. Ty stood in the yard, no longer shouting, no longer resisting, no longer lost in the same way he had been just hours before. No. He was quiet. Compliant. Exhausted. Officers moved in with precision, just as they had trained countless times before. Every step still calculated. Every motion still deliberate. Because even when a situation appears resolved, it isn't over until it's fully secured. His hands were guided behind his back. Cuffs applied. Check. Double locked. Standard procedure, but in this moment it meant everything. Because it marked the official end of the threat. The handgun that had turned this into a life-threatening situation was now out of play, already secured earlier during the surrender. The dog that had remained by his side was safely handled and removed from the immediate area. Every variable neutralized. As Ty was escorted away from the property, the reality of what had just happened began to settle in. 30 hours. That's how long this lasted. 30 hours of tension, uncertainty, and constant risk. What started as a simple call, a disturbance, a noise complaint, something routine, turned into a full-scale tactical operation involving SWAT units, crisis negotiators, drones, robotics, less lethal deployment, psychological strategy. And through all of it, not a single life was lost. That's what made this different. Because in situations like this, the margin for error is almost non-existent. Every decision matters. Every second counts. And the outcome often depends on things no one can fully control. Human behavior, mental state, fear, confusion. Inside that house, Ty wasn't just resisting arrest. He was fighting something else entirely. Something internal. Something that couldn't be seen through a drone camera or negotiated away with simple words. And that's what made this so dangerous. Because when someone loses touch with reality, there are no predictable rules. Only reactions. Only impulses. only moments, which is why the approach taken here mattered so much. SWAT didn't rush in. They didn't force a confrontation. They didn't escalate beyond control. They adapted, step by step, layer by layer, using time as a tool, using pressure as a strategy, using patience as a weapon. And in the end, it worked. But not because it was easy, because it wasn't. Behind every decision was risk. Behind every delay was uncertainty. Behind every tactic was the possibility that it might not be enough. But they stayed disciplined. They stayed controlled. And they stayed focused on one objective: resolve this without loss of life. As Ty was placed into the vehicle, the scene behind him began to shift. Officers started to stand down. Positions relaxed. Equipment lowered. The perimeter that had once been tight and impenetrable slowly opened back up. The neighborhood, which had been frozen in tension, began to breathe again. Residents stepped outside, cautiously at first, then more freely, processing what they had just witnessed. Because events like this don't just affect the people directly involved. They ripple outward, through streets, through communities, through everyone who watched it unfold in real time. And for many of them, the question lingered: how did it get this far? How does a situation go from a simple disturbance call to a 30-hour armed standoff? The answer isn't simple, because situations like this are rarely caused by just one thing. They build, over time, through layers of stress, instability, and unseen struggles. And sometimes, they reach a breaking point. What matters is how that moment is handled. And in this case, it was handled with precision, with restraint, with control. As the final reports began to take shape, the facts became clear. No officers injured. No civilians harmed. Suspect taken into custody. Firearm recovered. Scene secured. On paper, it would read like a successful operation. But behind those words was something much more complex. A reminder of how quickly situations can escalate. A reminder of how fragile control can be. And a reminder of how critical training, discipline, and patience are in moments where everything is on the line. Because this could have ended in headlines for all the wrong reasons. But instead, it became an example of what happens when every piece comes together the right way. When strategy overrides emotion. When control overrides chaos. And when the goal isn't just to end the situation, but to end it the right way. The house still stood, damaged, broken. A physical reflection of everything that had happened inside it. But it also stood as proof of something else. That even in the most volatile situations, there is still a path to resolution. It just takes time. And on that day, time made all the difference. If this story stayed with you, subscribing is the best way to support the channel. New true crime cases every week, told with respect, not sensationalism.